Swipple.
Great. Well, thank you. Great to be here. So Robin talked a little bit about the importance of why we do historical ecology, and I'll talk a little bit about how we do it before launching into what we found for the Delta. And so, our goal here is to map and describe conditions in the early 1800s before significant Euro-American modification. And so the process that we have is bringing together a wide array of information from the historical record, bringing that together into a cohesive synthesis of what conditions were like. And so our process, and hopefully, hopefully you can kind of crane your necks if
I know,
to see some
a lot
of
of our
these
slides don't show up very
graphics.
well. Sorry?
See it right there.
Directly in front of you is a screen that the council members can look at. Okay,
That's why it looks like you're staring at
sometimes we can't read it if it's small type, but we're not staring at you, we're staring at the screen.
We were trying to see your shoes is what we're trying to do.
it. It was a little disconcerting.
Okay, good. You can't, this on your printouts, they're tiny, so, well, good. Okay, so we're drawing from a diverse array of sources from the historical record, spanning many different eras. So our work really relies on a comprehensive data collection of what's out there. And so we're looking for sources like early maps, also diaries, people writing about their experience in the Delta right during in the early 1800s, mid 1800s, and also looking for photographs and artwork, and also aerial photography in the early 1900s. So we're really drawing from this rich array of sources from the historical record. And so we're going to many local, regional archives. Also, these days there's a lot available online. And so we're sifting through, thousands and thousands of individual pieces of raw data, bringing that together and bringing in-house and starting to work with, a smaller fraction of that. And then what we end up actually using in our detailed analysis and really synthesis process is a smaller portion of that, but still hundreds, if not thousands, of individual pieces of information. And so we bring that together. We're largely using a geographical information system, GIS, to bring this information together. It's both a warehouse to store our information and also the place where we start to map and describe conditions, start to recognize and pull together individual pieces. So you might have a map that shows the whole delta versus a parcel map that just shows an individual piece of property, and you can start to geolocate that and start to recognize the patterns of what the information is showing. This is kind of one example. This is actually looking in the Yolo Basin, and you can start to see with these multiple sources, it's this iterative process of source intercalibration where you start to recognize and recognize patterns. And in one map, something might pop out because you saw a pattern in a different map or a different description. And so as we go through, so this is an example, of a single feature, a lake in the Yolo Basin, where we start to recognize and be able to map that feature. And so as we go through the mapping process, for each feature that we map, we're documenting the sources that we use to map it, and also how confident we are in our mapping. So it gives us a sense of the conditions and how certain we are that the patterns are the way they are. And then, of course, the reporting process where we bring that information together and really describe those conditions. It's a documentation of the GIS that the mapping that we did, but also bringing in all the information that you can't necessarily see from the map itself, all the processes that form and maintain the system.
Excuse me,
Yes.
Allison, in your interview process with folks, because in some cases you're only a generation removed from folks who actually were, you have some folks who may be very elderly now, but in their 90s and maybe even approaching 100 years of age, but still may have good recall from what was directly told to them by their parents or certainly grandparents in the area. Are you able to do that outreach? Because again, that's a source that will dwindle.
Yes.
And continues to, you start losing folks who, again, have recollection. Again, may not be firsthand, but it's certainly secondhand, or they maybe have some firsthand early part of the 1900s. But reflecting back to the 1800s and settlement, again, in rare
Certainly,
cases,
yeah, the stories are there, and people. One person that I spoke with, they went back into their records and pulled out documentation from, I think, their grandparent who had written about the early reclamation period, the formation of their reclamation district. So there's information that's not out in the archives that's available in speaking with these folks. So.
Because I know there are still not just multi-generational families in the Delta, but certainly in the uplands that connect to, and I'm sure in areas to the west, and and trying to find those sources. But I think some of that may be lost even with the passing of that elder generation, because some of that again is only a generation removed, at least from what's been related to them. In a first-hand basis, and what they might recall of that, let alone what's written. Are you able to take that? I guess it's anecdotal in the sense that it may be the verbal, but that's a lot with your native peoples too. That was passed down through the tribal elders. Are you able to pick up that in your report or in your data research?
It helps in our interpretation. I think I certainly wish we would have been able to speak to more people and get a sense of things. But yeah, it's definitely.
How are you introduced into folks? Because I'm curious. Again, just because coming in as a researcher or a scientist, you need to gain confidence, obviously, of folks. Were you able to spend the time to do that, to actually relate to some of those folks and beyond?
We
going
spoke
to hard data places, I understand that, but I'm curious about.
Yeah, we didn't again speak to as many as I would have hoped. We only spoke to about 5 people, but certainly I think being able to talk about history is really a place where people feel comfortable sitting down at the table and talking about conditions and what the experience was like as the Delta transformed. So
again. I only ask that because I know the richness of people's recall and certainly the history, and some of that is in a kind of local repository, either in a family or a local historical society. And again, I know obviously you have a broad band of research has to occur here, and then you've got to layer it all as you're describing. Because it's important because a lot of times the reports don't reflect that, and I'm not saying yours doesn't. I haven't had a chance to even peruse it, but I would suggest that for folks that are doing this type of research, which is fascinating from what you're explaining thus far, I would just suggest that that's a source that both with your early settlers, your farmers, your native peoples, and so forth, that and some of that source continues to ebb away because people pass on, and some of that stuff's not important to the next generation, so it gets destroyed. I think in your work, if there was going to be some follow-up, I would suggest, and again, I would certainly offer through some of the contacts I have, but I think at the local level you can find a lot of folks, people are willing to put the time in that can help with that research. And it might, again, if you're trying to get a clear picture of what was and what worked then, at least from people's observation at the time, maybe not a scientific, but people's observation, some of that still exists out there, and you were able to get some of that, but I would suggest there might be more
There's
that
more out there,
you
for sure.
could access.
Yeah, it's a really excellent point. It's a strong point. The work that we did do in that regard, the contacts and the conversations were really helpful and enriched the report quite a bit. Those are relationships we have now. We sent them copies of the report, so they have more ownership of the product too. It's something that is time consuming and doesn't get a lot of value in the scientific world.
Right.
Arguably, it's really important, though, in terms of the application and the communications, the sort of dialogues that are going to need to happen in the future. So I think you're right on. It's something that I kind of wanted to mention in terms of your third co-equal goal or whatever, of the sense of place, the sort of understanding of place and shared, ownership of what that means. I think we sort of got a little into that, but there's a lot more with interviewing more folks and getting their thoughts out there and sort of sharing. We have stuff to bring to them too that they're usually really interested in. So it tends to break down. I know people in Sassoon, they still tell me, you talked to my dad before he died, and this is, these are bridges between environmental science and management and the people who actually own the land and stuff. These are potentially really important, I think, in the future. So I appreciate the point.
Okay. Thanks, Rob.
Great. All right, well, segue into talking about what we found for the Delta. So we just completed this process, as has been said, for the Delta. And this was a multi-year project and relied on a diverse and extensive team, drawing from both our team, our historical ecology group at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and also from staff at the California Department of Fish and Game. Our funding was through the Ecosystem Restoration Program. So just to introduce you to our study area, it looks a little bit different from the legal delta, and that's because we defined it on using a topographic boundary, so using the 25-foot elevation contour, and extending from the Feather River in the north down to the Stanislaus River in the south. So that's basically capturing, that extent is basically the extent of tidal influence historically. So this is a study area that covers about 800,000 acres, and I wanted you to see that map because it kind of places things in context. Our mapping actually of the perennial wetlands in the Delta in our study area represents about 40% of what's estimated to have existed historically in the Central Valley, so a pretty significant area. And also I wanted to point out here, so I'll try to use the pointer. I don't know if that's going to be very helpful, but looking up here where the American River comes in, that's kind of the northern extent of where the legal delta is today. So we cover most of the area of the legal delta. And moving on. So I wanted to put this up here just to recognize the importance of understanding the many transformations that the Delta has gone through. I don't necessarily want you to read it, but to recognize that there are many different eras. The third row down there showing the different eras of the decline in indigenous management and the uptake of fur trapping in the early 1800s, and then in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, the increase in agriculture as reclamation occurs, and then later on the exports that have started and water withdrawals in the dam building era. So this kind of transformation is an important context for our research, but it's not necessarily the focus. Our focus was really to describe the conditions prior to these major transformations. But understanding, the types, the context, and the timing of the changes really helps us interpret the past conditions and understand how the past delta really mediated human interaction with it. So I'm going to give you a couple of slides just of the kind of the summary from our GIS, from our mapping work, and then quickly move into kind of the details or the fun stuff, the richer information about what the delta looked like and why. So just a quick summary here. So if you're looking at our study area here, the blues, the dark blue represents open water, the blue-green and lighter green represents perennial wetlands, tidal and non-tidal, and then the lighter colors are seasonal wetlands and grasslands and oak woodland savannas. And so if you're looking at the relative wetness that the Delta experienced historically, you're looking at close to 400,000 acres of tidal areas. That includes open water and wetland. And then an additional about 124,000 acres of perennially wet perennial wetlands. And then in our mapping, an additional 144,000 acres of seasonal wetlands. So then breaking that down, just looking at the habitat types we mapped, so the tidal channels, we mapped about 1,600 miles of channel, which amounts to more than or close to 27,000 acres. The smaller tidal channels, those that aren't the main river networks or major sloughs that we know of in the Delta, those were a very significant portion of our mapping for the length of tidal channels. They were made up about 3/4 of the total length. And then lakes and ponds, we mapped 83 individual features. And with the freshwater wetlands, we have close to 365,000 acres of tidal wetlands, over 113,000 acres of non-tidal wetlands. And the riparian forest, mostly, of course, lining the Sacramento River, and there we mapped about 42,000 acres with willow thickets as well. And then the seasonal wetlands that I mentioned earlier, made up of vernal pools, of wet meadows, and also alkali seasonal wetlands. And then, of course, the land cover change, the concept that we're all aware of, the dramatic and almost complete transformation that has occurred through time over the last 160 years. This is an important reminder, being able to see this past-present comparison, see the conversion of wetlands to agriculture, but also to, more importantly, perhaps to recognize, in this case, to recognize the fragmented landscape that we have today, and recognize that it's really hard to see the big picture, see how pieces might fit together in our contemporary landscape. So that's, an important value of the historical ecology research, is to be able to start seeing the pattern more than recognizing just the story of the loss, but to recognize the pattern. And so, just to mention this a little bit more with the loss and the change through time, today we have about 3% of the historical freshwater wetlands of the area that we had historically. And then also, interestingly, the ratio of the open water to freshwater wetland has really shifted. So historically, you had about 14 times more wetland than you did open water, whereas today you have about 5 times more open water than wetlands. So kind of that relationship between land and water has really shifted. And the position of where that open water is really changed. We have the large areas in Frank's Tract in the Central Delta today, whereas historically it was farther upstream in the North and South Delta. And as I mentioned, these smaller tidal channels were a really important part of the story historically, and that's really what we've lost. And many of the natural habitats today are actually there are few former true remnants. Many of the natural habitats have gone through a lot of transformation already. And then finally, we have really highly fragmented natural habitats, as I mentioned earlier. And so perhaps, more importantly is, aside from the story of loss, is really understanding the pattern and process. And so that's what this report is all about, is being able to describe kind of the processes that underlie what we see in the historical delta. So now I'm going to get into kind of the main framework and what I want to delve into in the remainder of my time here. So, there are many details in this report, but kind of the overarching framework here is that there were multiple landscapes in the delta, that habitat mosaics were arranged in distinct patterns, and that those were expressed across broad physical gradients in the landscape. So really this point...